As you know, here at Rocky Peak, we have the 7 values for our church that guide us. And the second one is authenticity, living the truth. And one of the things that I've noticed about Jesus, so that kind of captures my heart about Jesus, is he doesn't really care where you've come from, but he really cares where you're going. But what he does require is sort of a radical honesty, you know? And so when you look at the New Testament, you look at the life of Jesus, the one kind of person that he could not help was the religious leaders that refused to be honest about their lives. They refused to be honest, and so they were measuring their spiritual maturity with the wrong yardstick, with the wrong ruler. And so they kept seeing themselves mature, but Jesus said, you're cleaning the outside of the cup and not the inside of the cup. You're straining at gnats, you're swallowing camels, you're tithing down to the mint, your herb gardens, but you're neglecting the weightier matters of the law of justice and mercy and compassion, things like that. And so I think that that emotional health and spiritual health are very close together. Yeah. It's almost impossible to separate them. And I think that and that all begins with an authenticity of being real about who we are. And then if you can create a culture where there's a freedom, which requires a lot of grace, you know, and so this means that you measure your spirituality, your spiritual maturity in different ways. And if you can create an environment where there's an environment of grace that, hey, we don't care where you're coming from, we care where you're going. And to get there, the first step to growth in any area of our life is radical honesty. And as you teach that, you model that, as people begin to experience that, I think that's the foundation. That's where it begins. Yeah. Because as long as you're pretending, you can never have an emotionally healthy church.
Yeah.
Yeah, you just can't, you know.
Totally. Are there any like specific instances, and maybe you won't be able to think of or share any of these, but like where you've kind of seen that happen, where there was like an inauthenticity in leadership or whatever?
Yeah, well, I think here's what I find often in Christian circles, you know, that often what is taught from the front is not lived out behind the scenes. And it's almost like a businessman who says, I know what the Bible says, but I'm in business, and in business, this is what you need to do to succeed. That we can take that same mentality into the church. We're teaching one thing, but behind the scenes, whether it's with staff or with individuals, that we're not really living out what the Word says in terms of how to do relationship, and we're justifying for whatever. Maybe it's out of jealousy, maybe it's out of fear. Maybe it's out of bitterness. But, you know, so for example, that behind the scenes, maybe church leadership is manipulating people. Maybe they're cutting people off the knees when they do something wrong. They're shaming them, whatever the thing is. And so I think that it just creates this message that there's one message for the weekend when we're teaching, but a different message. And I think the beautiful thing about the Bible is that the New Testament just is full of relational advice. You know, we're to love one another, but what does that look like? Well, here's what it looks like, and it's just full of that. But if you look at our lives, often we don't really put that into practice. Yeah. In the crunch times, during times of conflict, during times where integrity is tested, things like that. And when you do, it just encourages then kind of a dual standard. We know what we all believe, but this is what we really operate. Yeah. And we may not even articulate it that way, but just like in a family, there's written rules and there's unwritten rules. Yeah. And those unwritten rules really undercut authenticity.
Yeah, totally. Well, it's funny, I think families, I think that can be a really significant aspect of why someone might walk away from the faith, is if they were raised in a family that was going to church and then not living it out 100%. Monday through Friday.
Yeah. And I think that often parents, because they're afraid of what might happen with their children, don't really give them the freedom and encouragement to think. You know? Yeah. And I think that you can only put up with that for most people for a certain amount of time, to where it's like, you know, this doesn't feel real. It doesn't feel authentic. Yeah. And it creates conflict. Yeah.
Totally. Yeah. Have you ever experienced a emotionally, spiritually unhealthy church environment or kind of situation?
I've been really fortunate. I've in my adult life, I've really just been part of two churches, and I think for the most part, they've both done a pretty good job.
Yeah.
Of that. I think when I was growing up, the church I grew up in, I think there were stories where that was not always the case. That I was sort of young, and I went there through high school, and you're not really involved in leadership. And I think my parents did a good job of not bringing all of that home. And so I didn't really, I think it was probably there to a large degree, but I didn't experience it firsthand. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
I think, what I would say is that where I experience it is so much through other people,
Yeah.
I think that over the years, I think Rocky Peak has been a place of great healing for so many people that have been maybe burned or hurt in different places. And so when you come, you hear their stories, and you often hear them right away, like at a Next Step dessert.
Yeah.
It's amazing how people will feel the freedom to share their painful journey right there in front of everybody,
Yeah.
And so I think that's been more kind of how I've, seen it operate.
Totally.
Operation, yeah.